Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Wow. Tim, watch where you're going. You just got Ectoplasm on the latest copy of Psychic News from England.
Yeah, two great tastes that go great together.
Well, looks like we're going to delve into two hot topics this week. UFOs and the spirit world, and I'm sure somewhere they will come together. So, Tim, how you been doing out there in the Corn Belt?
Corn Belt. That's a little bit further north of where I live. It's a little hillier down around here in southwestern Indiana. Now, you know where I grew up, which was in north central Indiana, Tim. I mean, that definitely was a Corn Belt. I mean, you could stand on my front porch and see all the way into Illinois. It was that flat.
Kind of like the Field of Dreams.
Very much so. Very much so.
Indeed. So, what have you been up to?
Well, I have been reading an absolutely fantastic new book that's just been released from Inner Light Global Communications. What's that title again? Yes, Winged Wonders.
Weird Winged Wonders.
Winged Wonders. I can't say that five times fast.
I didn't expect you to say it 5 times. Only but yes, that's our latest release, and we're just sending out review copies and getting all kinds of positive feedback on it. I think people will really like that. It's really strange and bizarre, just like our show is. And speaking of exploring the bizarre, Tim, who do we have on as our special guest tonight?
Oh, well, Tim, we, as always, we have just the best guest here on Exploring the Bizarre. And so with us tonight is Shannon TAGGART. Now, Shannon is a photographer based in Brooklyn, New York, not too far from you, Tim. Her photographs have been exhibited and featured internationally, included in Time, New York Times Magazine, Discover, Newsweek. You know, her work has been recognized by Nikon, Magnum Photos, and the American Photography. Let's see, from 2014 to 2016, she was scholar and artist in residence at the Morbid Anatomy.
That's harder than Weird Winged Wonders.
It is. Museum in New York. Now, right now, she is putting together a book that it's still in the process, and I guess that this has been a process that's been going on for quite a while. Its title is Seance, Spiritualist Ritual, and the Search for Ectoplasm. And hopefully, if her funding sources come through, she'll be able to get this out soon, because I know I can't wait to read this book. I've seen some of her photographs at various other locations, and this should be an absolutely fantastic book, Tim. So now our other guest with us tonight is Les VELEZ. Now, Les is the graduate of the University of Vermont with a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration. Now, beginning in September of 1970, he served in the U.S. Army as a field artillery officer, and he joined MUFON in 1991 and has held the following positions: field investigator, training coordinator for field investigators, the assistant state director in Northern California, chairman of the AERC, Abduction Experiencer Research Committee, for those who don't know that, and team leader of the ART Abduction Response Team. Les founded in 1994, he co-founded Opus, the Organization for Paranormal Understanding and Support, and the mission of Opus is to educate and support people having unusual, anomalous personal experiences. Such experiences may include extraordinary states of consciousness, spiritual or parapsychological phenomena, or even close encounters with non-human entities and or UFO activity. So we've got a really a well-rounded show tonight.
I was gonna say I'm putting in with Tina for an extra hour right now. Because it looks like there's a lot of information out here that we've got to just grab onto. I've always been fascinated, Shannon, by the seances and mysticism and mediumship. We've published a couple of books on the topic. 30 Years Among the Dead. We also have a book called Dark Seance about the Davenport brothers. And, with UFOs, we have cases where UFOs have landed, left scorched earth behind, and ripped up the soil and left other tidbits of physical evidence. But in the spiritualist field or spiritualist movement, we have the very strange substance known as ectoplasm. Now, Shannon, are you a spiritualist?
I don't really kind of classify myself as, and I mean, the closest thing I guess I would label myself as a Fortean. So us
too. Yeah, let's hear it for Charles Fort. You bet. Yeah, absolutely.
So that said, I'm constantly questioning
yes.
my experiences and what's happening. And so, but I am very open to spiritualism, and I've had a lot of very strange, interesting experiences. I've had readings and healings, and I mean, every kind of experience spiritualism offers, I've pretty much engaged with. And I have found a lot there to explore, and a lot of true mystery and high strangeness. So yeah, I guess that would how I would answer.
Well, I have been to Camp Lilydale and to Camp Chesterfield. And Tim, weren't you raised around one of the spiritualist camps there?
Yes. I lived in the same county as Camp Chesterfield, and when I got older and realized it was there, went there a number of times, and had a chance to visit Lilydale at least once.
Yeah, I know. Of course, the spiritualist movement, and maybe Shannon, you could take us back to when it started, maybe to the Fox sisters, if not before.
Yes. So in 1848, in upstate New York, two young girls, Kate and Margaret Fox, said they were in communication with the spirit of a man who was buried beneath their home, and started communicating with this spirit with a form of letter-coded rapping. And the neighbors started to come over and see this phenomena, and soon their older sister was taking them to Rochester, New York, which was the closest city to where they were, and they were having public seances. And they didn't set out to start a movement that spread across the Western world and became a religion and a philosophy. It was kind of like an accidental founding. It kind of took set afire by this small act by these young girls.
I'm curious, Shannon, before we really get too much into your photography with the spiritualists and the mediums, I want to know a little bit more about yourself and how you got involved and interested in photography in the first place.
I got interested in photography when I was in high school, and it's funny because the moment that I got interested in photography, around that very same time, my cousin went to Lilydale, New York, and she went to a message service. And so I grew up in Buffalo, New York, which is about an hour away from Lilydale. And these message services in Lilydale, you go into the woods and there's benches and you don't fill out your name or anything. They're anonymous, and the mediums stand in the front and they pick people out to give them short messages. And my cousin was chosen, and the medium revealed details about my grandfather's death that proved to be true and proved to be this weird story about how he died. And it was kind of like a family secret. And so she came back and told our family what they had told her, and it sent shockwaves, through my entire family. And everyone was, just really shocked by how this woman could have known this. And so being in, high school at this time, I was thinking, how could somebody possibly know that? I became so intrigued, but I didn't pursue it until years later when I became a professional photographer. I was working as a photojournalist, and I decided to begin a project that explored spiritualism.
Well, now, okay, so the Fox sisters sort of started it off. But we also, I remember in this book on the Davenport brothers, they were known at the time, of course, very controversial, as the best physical mediums. They would sit in a spirit cabinet with the doors locked and their hands tied. And all of a sudden, the lights that were put out in the room were at least dimmed. And musical instruments would float above their head. They would come out of the top of the cabinet and rummage around the room and play melodies and bang numbers. And then, of course, the seance would be over, and they would open the spiritualist cabinet, and there would be the Davenport brothers with their hands still tied, so that no collusion or fraud could be said to have occurred. Of course, this is not necessarily the case. A lot of mediums in the early days were caught with their ectoplasm down, I guess, so to speak. But who were there? Was also wasn't there two sisters who painted spirit photos?
Yes, the Bang sisters.
Bang sisters, more bang for your buck. That's what I always say. Yeah.
Yes, and the Davenport brothers, I think, are truly fascinating, and I plan to write something about them in the text of my book, because they are a great example of the ambiguity that is embedded in spiritualism. They refused to call themselves magicians or mediums. They allowed the audience to decide that. And this would, they would travel around the world. Their Spirit Cabinet Act was one of the most popular shows
they had
of the era.
They had a run for their lives on several occasions. They got
Yes.
beat up. One woman fell down from the balcony, I think, in Philadelphia. The police were called on a number of occasions, and they had a slink out of town, I think, in Australia. At the before the crack of dawn. So some of these early spiritualists had a lot of pressure on them, not unlike the UFO contactees and abductees of today. I would say. Okay, so what is, for the record, ectoplasm?
So ectoplasm is a spiritualist. It's a substance. It's kind of like a holy substance for spiritualists that represents the merging of the spiritual and material realms. So it's a substance, like it's a paradoxical substance that is both spiritual and material at the same time. And it usually emerges in the classic form, emerges from the body of the medium and becomes, starts out thin and then thickens and takes shape and takes form. And in some of the old spirit images, you'll see it looks like cheesecloth or linen, or, with two-dimensional faces embedded within it. And it's a very controversial topic and controversial substance. within spiritualism. And there's also different definitions for it. Some people say, it's a spiritual ether. It's an energy. It can change atmosphere, hypnotic perceptions, temperature. Others say, no, it's only when it's in that white, objective, stream-like form that everybody can see. I find there's some fluidity to the term. Depending on what seance room you're in, you're not really sure what kind of ectoplasm they're talking about. And so I found that fascinating as well.
Yeah, they made fun of the whole premise of ectoplasm in the original Ghostbusters movie. They called it slime, but I mean, basically that's what they were referring to. That was supposed to be ectoplasm.
Yes, and when I'm giving my lectures and showing my images, I always start off with, the first time I heard the term ectoplasm was through the movie Ghostbusters. Mm-hmm. And I think many people, that's why they're familiar with the word. And that is because Dan Aykroyd is actually a fourth generation spiritualist.
Absolutely.
And he's drawing the term, from the actual practice and using it in the film, but he's drawing it from spiritualist ritual.
Yeah, they used to have, his grandparents had seances right in the parlor room up there in Canada where he lived. And his father, I think 6 or 7 years ago, wrote a very good book on the history of spiritualism.
Yes. And Dan Aykroyd is actually going to contribute the foreword to my book, which is I'm pretty excited about.
Absolutely excellent. Now, we have a really wild synchronicity that took place that involves the Blues Brothers. It's too long to go into, and you guys are the guest on the show, and we have repeated it on the air before, but really wild. Just totally something out of a Philip K. Dick Blade Runner book, Total Recall.
So now, now the spiritualist movement, even though it started in the mid 19th century, is still around today. How big was it at its peak?
The estimates vary. Classically, it was said 11 million in the United States alone. That has been, now there's historians that are saying, it was probably less than 4 million. But at its peak, spiritualism truly, it was challenged Christianity for the most popular religion. I mean, it was incredibly popular. And
well, it actually incorporates Christianity. That's the one thing I never really liked too much about spiritualism. If you went to a spiritualist service like it was the one in Florida, Casadega, it was life after death with a lot of Christianity put in there, and they didn't believe in reincarnation. Of course, now you have spiritualism, and then you have spiritism, which is slightly different in that they do believe in reincarnation and some of the other things that the spiritualist movement don't. But the spiritualist movement was the largest and is still very active in the UK. I know I get the Psychic News, this very glossy magazine from over there, and they list hundreds and hundreds of churches that are still very active. Here, there are churches in various parts of the country, but there are a lot fewer than there were when I first got involved in the metaphysical back in the late 60s.
Yes, spiritualism is definitely more alive in England, and that's why I've actually spent a lot of time in England photographing there. And the spiritism, I would argue that that's the most alive, and I would say in Brazil specifically.
Yes. Well, that would be more or less the spiritism in Brazil, Alan Kardec, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and and then it traveled, from France to Brazil and South America, and even Portugal. There's a movement called Spiritism.
I think we have a spirit coming through now.
No, my Skype was acting a little. It sometimes switches my mic off. So can you hear me now?
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry.
Okay. So so you say you spent a lot of time in the UK, where spiritualism is a lot more active than here. Are you familiar with the seances by the group? Is it the Soul group?
The Skull Group, yes.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I actually recently traveled to Spain, where Robin and Sandra Foy, who are the two of the four members of the Skull experiment, where they live, and I actually photographed some of the Skull apports for my book, and that was a really exciting experience. And one of the objects, one of my favorite ones that I was able to photograph, was a device that they created through the plans of Thomas Edison. Gave them plans in the seance room, and then they built this device. It's transcommunication device. I'm drawing a blank on the exact term of it, but it was used for communication, and they had coins. They had a variety of objects that they had gotten. Yeah.
Yeah, there was they had a small group of maybe 10 members that would meet on a regular basis in somebody's darkened basement. And they would, of course, turn the lights off, but they had all these materializations, very impressive, actually, taking place. And they had, video recorders on recording all of the manifestations. And like you say, there were apports involved in the seances. And, of course, apports are really not new when it comes to mediumship and seances. They go way back. In fact, I have seen, and I don't know how honest the mediums were being here, where they would pull out big jewels and rubies and whatever from their mouth or their ears or their nose or whatever, and they claim that these were materializations from the seance world, although some people suspect that they might have been right off the bottom shelf in Woolworths. be that as it may. That Tim, in fact, didn't you see some apports one time?
Well, yeah, but not in a seance type of situation. That was a house where a poltergeist was happening. But yeah, I mean, it was apports. It was rocks falling from the ceiling.
Well, that way, and then you would throw the rock. You would mark the rock and throw it outside, and it would come back through the ceiling again.
Oh yeah, well, it was a handful of rocks, and I'd marked them with a magic marker and threw them out in the cornfield in the out behind the house, and then just not even just a few minutes later, they came back. You heard of the cat coming back, but this was the rocks came back.
Well, I remember we published a book not too long ago called Diane. She came from Venus up Rainbow Hill, mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong. I believe the author's name is Hope Troxel.
Possibly, yeah.
Oh, okay. Anyway, she was part of a spiritualist church in the late 1940s in California, and a small group. I mean, I think they had 35 or 40 members, but she would have this materialization of this very attractive spirit entity, maybe 6 feet tall on a number of occasions, and then she started receiving messages on a regular basis about how this woman was from another dimension on the planet Venus. Anyway, we're coming up on our first break, but don't turn that dial, and don't go anywhere unless you're going to materialize. Back with us in a few minutes.
Exploring the bizarre. Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Back again on Exploring the Bizarre. And Tim, I think it's time that we bring our other guest in. He's been patiently or impatiently, maybe, who knows, waiting in the wings to get his 15 minutes on the show, or it's more than 15 minutes. So what do you think? Shall we bring him in?
Well, you would be amiss if you didn't.
That's right. Well, Les, thank you very much for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
All right, so now here we've been talking in the first half hour, about spiritualism and the spirits and life after death and all of that. But a lot of people don't realize that there is kind of a fine line, really, between UFOs, the UFO phenomena, and ghost and hauntings and spiritualism. Would you agree with that?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think it's all part of a puzzle, this universal puzzle that we experience. We deal with our reality, on one level, but then there are other realities. There's other energies. There's so much that we don't understand. And so, yes, the abduction phenomena is certainly one. The UFOs, poltergeist activity is certainly another. And we just truly have an issue of getting our arms around the whole process. People ask me all the time, what are we dealing with? Are they extraterrestrial in nature? Are they time travelers? Are they interdimensional? Is it the military? Well, you know what? I believe it's all the above. It certainly can be all the above. Mm-hmm. And we just, are living in our own little box here, and there's a whole lot going on around us that is so unique, so incredible that it's paranormal.
Well, Dr. Leo Sprinkle has said that when he has conducted hypnotic sessions, or even just talking to experiencers, that he's been told that whatever intelligence this is that they've had experiences with has told them that they travel not through linear spaces, as we think of, like a conventional spaceship, a rocket flying through space, but actually at one point actually travels through what we would call, the spirit world or the astral world. And that some of these experiencers said that while they were on board these crafts, that they actually had visitations from their loved ones who have passed on. And I just always found that just a fascinating concept.
Yeah, I think that during these experiences that people have, there's so many different. You have spiritual awakening, Kundalini awakening, things of that nature that occur, and so being on board a craft, for instance, and seeing someone that's passed on, we're not sure. One of the fascinating things, I don't know if we're going to have time to get to it, is that MUFON actually, Mutual UFO Network, actually funded a study that I coordinated. And we took 72 people that felt that they had been abducted and 54 people that were a control group. And what we found was that these people were not fantasy prone. They weren't crazy, and that there was some stressors early on in their life that caused them to open up, and also caused their temporal lobe activity to be a little bit different than the control group. And we want to do another study to kind of go further into that area. But getting back to where you were coming from, the physics that we understand now is not right in order for these entities to come here from wherever they're coming from. There's a new physics that's out there, and they're getting closer to it. They're getting closer to it, quantum physics and the string theory and all this kind of stuff, and the brands and all these different dimensions that rub up against each other. That one of the things that we've experienced through a couple of abductees is had a case in Santa Cruz, California. where this couple observed this craft coming in over the ocean, comes over their head in behind this little canyon behind them. They were in Butano State Park, and this is fairly high up off the ocean floor there, and this happened 4 more times, and these craft sat in the canyon. And they did this kind of butterfly move where they just all sat there and just waved up and down, and then all of a sudden they went vertical, and it's like they went around a corner, and then they disappeared. And so what is that? Is that some other dimension that they went into? Because a lot of these experiences that happen, the craft just seems to instantaneously disappear, or are able to do things that are just beyond our physics right now.
And also too, when the people, well, more so in the case of contactees, I suppose, as opposed to abductees, they say that they've been snatched and taken away. They go to somewhere else almost instantaneously. I mean, it's like they're teleported to another solar system or star system that looks peculiar, very strange to them, but they're able to walk out and breathe just like they're able to do the ultra-terrestrials, as I call them, are able to do here. I mean, there seems to be a parallel universe at play here, because certainly, in the early days they talked about going to Venus or Mars or some other place in our own solar system, and that seems very impractical, at least on in a physical sense. But yet I don't think that you can say that these events are not happening, because they are happening over and over and over and again, and it's not like it's something that's just happening here in the United States. As you know, Les, it certainly is a worldwide phenomenon. We've got some of the strangest, most documented reports from Brazil. That's always been one of my favorite locales for getting information. In the old days, there were a couple of groups down there that actually put out a English language newsletter, and they had some incredible reports of UFO giants and one-eyed cyclops and winged beings, and it was just some wonderful information that was coming our way. And of course, we have AJ Gerard, who does the magazine in Brazil, UFO magazine, which I think is the longest running UFO magazine in the world. In fact, it may be one of the few, because the Australian magazine, The Ufologist, just went out of business today. And they have been running for 20 years, and they were the last of the printed magazines in English, and now they are no more.
Yeah, by the way, AJ has passed away, so...
No way!
Yeah,
When?
I think last year.
Oh,
last year. Yep.
Well, I that's funny. There's nothing on his site that I saw, because I was just there today. Oh, that's terrible. I met him years ago. He stopped by when he was in the U.S. and we had a drink downstairs in the restaurant. Very friendly chap, and certainly very, very well informed.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He's done a great job for sure. Yeah. One of the things too that you kind of triggered something. We talk about how many people are having these types of experience. Well, back in 1991, the Roper organization did a survey, and they basically came up with 8 million people that were having these types of experiences. Well, that was 1991, and I guarantee you it's been a hell of a lot more people than that experiencing these type of phenomena. People ask me a lot of times, so why are you into this? I mean, you got a business background, and what happened that you got involved with all of this? And well, when I was 11 years old, I saw something that scared the hell out of me, and I went to the library, started to read books on UFOs, and the books that I picked up were George Adamski's books, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Oh, yeah. So basically, I was doing that for a while, and then graduated from high school, and then went off to college and got married, had a couple of kids, and moved out to California. and was living in San Jose, and I picked up the paper one day, and Stanton Friedman was going to be talking about UFOs and a government cover-up. And so I went to San Jose City College expecting to see a handful of people there. Well, the auditorium was packed. MUFON had a table out there hawking their journals. And so I decided, well, I'm going to get that because I want to get more involved. And that wasn't enough. After a while, I decided, well, I got to become a field investigator. So I did. In all the cases, almost without exception, that I investigated, turned out to be abduction cases in the end. Most of the time, people have a sighting like that. An abduction usually follows. Then these people asked me, "Do you know of other people having these types of experiences?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And next thing I know, I'm facilitating a support group, and that was fascinating to listen to these people talk about their experiences. And this one day, this woman in the group said to me, "I've seen you before." I said, "Oh, really? Where? At the mall? At grocery store, or whatever?" She says, "No, I saw you aboard a ship." And I said, "Really?" And so I kind of blew it off because it wasn't something that I had any conscious recollection of. And so so the support groups continued. It was probably 2 years later that a gentleman in the group says, "Hey, I've seen you before." "Really? Where?" "On board the craft, and you were freaking out, and they told me to go over and help you, calm you down." And I said, "Oh my God." So subsequent to that, I had 3 hypnotic sessions, regressions, and I had a lot of past lives, but I never brought up anything about being on a craft. But make a long story short, we started this organization in 1994 called OPUS, the Organization for Paranormal Understanding and Support. And the support part is really the major thing that we're doing these days, because we have an online support group that's totally confidential. We have over 100 people in it from around the world that are talking to each other 24/7 and talking about their experiences. And I get 2 or 3 calls a week adding people to that group. And it's one of the things that's so important when people are having these types of experiences, to be able to talk to someone that will listen to them and understand what they're going through. And so this has proved to be a very, very positive thing. And so I was really happy to get that started with a doctor friend of mine back in 1994. And we're officially 501(c) nonprofit organization, so even the IRS recognizes us.
All right, now I want you to backtrack a little bit. I want to know more about the experience that you said that you had when you were a kid that scared the hell out of you. Can you talk about that?
Oh, sure. It's pretty mundane. I'll tell you another story about some people in the group, but it was late October, and I was out coming in from feeding my dog Caesar, and I was on the way back.
You won't believe this. You're talking about your dog Caesar. I am on the Caesars Atlantic City website right at this moment.
Oh,
now that's a synchronicity. Maybe we'll win $100,000.
I hope so.
Yeah, well, we tried that before. That was tied in with Dan Aykroyd. I don't want to go into it, but it didn't work. But I'm on the Caesars Atlantic City rate calendar right now. Okay, anyway, continue. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
but I just had to throw that in. Yes.
So I looked off to my right, and where we lived, it was fairly wooded, and so there was this object. It was totally silent. It was this oval, whitish, best I could describe it, thing, just kind of floating and going by. And so I ran in the house and I tried to get my father to come out. Finally, I convinced him to come on out. And by the time he came out there, it was gone. And, I've seen searchlights, reflecting off clouds and things like that. And that was the first thing my father said to me. He says, "Well, this is probably just a beacon of light somewhere reflecting off a cloud." I said, "Nah, didn't really look like that. And so that's what drove me to the library and started reading about all of George's books and Adamski's books, and it was fascinating. But I'll tell you this one story. This couple came to the support group meeting, and first thing they did, they had a picture of a rash that they had, and they wanted to know if anybody else in the group had a similar rash. And so they showed the picture around the group, and almost without exception, they all had the similar rash at one time. And one of the people in the group says, well, I know what that's from. And so we said, oh, really? Okay, what is it? He says, that's the fluid that they dip you in when they bring you on board the craft to sanitize you. And some people have reactions. So that was a mind blower right there. But there's just so many stories that go along with each of these cases that, in a way, they're all very similar in a broad sense. That they get abducted, they're brought on board the craft, they things happen to them, and then they're brought back. That's it, very short scenario. Sometimes they're shown various, things on screen, showing destruction and, all kinds of negative things that if we don't get our act together. And that's one thing that happens with these people that are abducted by the end of this process. And it's a spiritual process, by the way. It's not a religious thing. It's a spiritual thing where people come out the other end of these experiences and say, hey, we got to be good to our fellow man. We have to take care of the earth, the water, the air, the animals, the trees, you name it. And it's absolutely fascinating to see them go through this process where in the beginning they're absolutely terrified. Then they come to a point where they finally come to accept it. And then at the end, if it stops, it's sort of like the Stockholm syndrome where all of a sudden, hey, it's not happening. I mean, where are you? How come you're not, coming to see me? So it's a fascinating phenomena. And the things that occur, being able to go through walls, for instance, which, talk about poltergeist activity. I mean, that's right up that alley. So there's a lot of similarities. Yes, absolutely. Shannon's doing her thing there, and that's absolutely an important part of this whole phenomena, I think, that we're trying to get our arms around.
Well, and with the abduction phenomena, it's a generational phenomena as well. I mean, very rarely do you have somebody who claims to have been abducted that you go and do a little research and find that maybe mom or dad or even as far back as parents or grandparents or great grandparents as well. Absolutely, and not only that. There's certain groups that also the Native Americans have a real strong seem to be picked out to be followed. Military people with military backgrounds. So yeah, very generational. You'll have mothers, and all of a sudden, like a daughter will come to the mother and say, I'm having these experiences, and the mother kind of blows it off. But then later on in life, she finally confesses and saying, well, you know what, I've had those same things. And so, what is that? What is happening? And so, I believe that this is not any type of mental state that we certainly we don't understand. It's not a psychopathology that's going on. It's real. I mean, Dr. John Mack, has delved into that and done a fantastic job. And almost lost his job at Harvard over that. Unfortunately, he got run over in the UK, which is kind of mysterious. But and then the kids in South Africa that
I mean, the whole school saw this thing come down, and entities come out, and so what is this?
Mm-hmm.
Is it extraterrestrial? Is it interdimensional? Like I said before, or is it all the above? And,
well, one of the things that I've always found fascinating by this, and I've been around long enough and have researched this long enough to, have seen it, different things come and go. You had, like, back in the early 1950s, into the 60s and even the 70s, you had the whole contactee movement, and that has kind of, pretty much disappeared, or at least the public part of it has, only to be replaced by the so-called abduction or experiencer phenomena. And I realize that this is a speculation on your part, but I mean, what's the difference? I mean, why has this happened?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from a technological standpoint, we've progressed in the last 60 years so far.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm an older guy. I remember looking at a little tiny, circular TV screen, black and white, and look at where we are today. It's like Star Trek or Star Wars, or the technology we have. So I think that's kind of what happens. That our perspective on a situation is molded by what we're dealing with at the time. And I think, we've progressed way past, the giant rock meetups and things like that. Although we're having more UFO conventions than you can shake a stick at these days. I mean, they're all over the place. And so that's taking a place.
What part of the country do you live in, Les?
No, I'm in Texas now.
Texas. Okay.
Texas.
All right.
Yeah. I'm originally from Connecticut, and Shannon, I got to tell you, I got married in Leroy, New York. You know where that is?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And so I know the East Coast very well, and I lived there for many years, and then moved out to California in '85, and got into business out there, and then just recently retired, and so now I decided that it's too damn expensive in San Jose, and I moved to Texas.
Now, do you've lived in several different places? Do you notice an attitude differential when you move from place to place?
Yes, there's no question about it. The California is much more open to all of this. Connecticut, at the time, I probably couldn't give you a very good feel on that, because I was a lot younger and wasn't paying much attention to that area.
John White used to have his conventions there. That was the one.
Oh.
Yeah.
All right, I need to interrupt you all because it's time to go to our next break. And when we come back, we'll have more Exploring the Bizarre. So stay tuned.
Exploring the Bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to the second hour of Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz. And Tim, we just have a fascinating program tonight. And I want to bring Shannon back into the conversation because I've got a lot of questions that I want to ask her. Now, Shannon, in doing my research before the show about you, I've run across some articles that, go, maybe, as far back as, was it 2012, maybe 2013, where at that point you were already starting to take photographs of mediums and seances and things like that. I mean, how long now have you been working on this project leading up to this book?
I actually began the project in 2001.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's 17 years in the making. And it took me that long because it's such a complicated topic. And there's a lot of fascinating history behind it. And there's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of ways to look at things. So yeah, 17 years.
So now, where was what was the first place that you visited, or perhaps I should say, who was the first medium that you took shots of?
So the first place I began the project in Lilydale, New York. So it's the world's largest spiritualist community, and the first medium who allowed me to photograph her was a woman named Gretchen Clark, and I was sitting in on one of her readings, and she was giving messages to clients, speaking to their people, their relatives, and all of a sudden she turned to me and she said, "Shannon, Margaret's here," and I thought, I don't know if I know a Margaret, and she says Texas. What does Texas mean? And my stomach just sank. Because I did have a great aunt named Margaret from Texas, and she had recently passed. Hello.
You're cutting in and out just a little bit. So go ahead, continue.
And that was my first, I guess, my first moment of, oh my gosh, something's happening here. I had even forgot that I had this Aunt Margaret, and she was from Texas, and she had recently passed. So that and when I first began the project, I couldn't really understand how you could be a sane person and speak with dead people. But I was so curious, and I did believe that there was something genuine happening. I just didn't know how to look at it, or I didn't really understand it. I was very green. I had never, before I began this project, I had never had a reading before. I just had the experience of my cousin that I was, that drew me there.
Now, what was the reaction of these people when you first approached them and said, "Hey, I want to take your pictures"? I mean, did they welcome you with open arms, or were you met with some suspicion?
Actually, the people of Lilydale were incredibly gracious and generous with their time, and they basically sat me down and taught me everything I know about spiritualism, and they were patient with me. I would just go and literally knock on doors and ask people to tell me about their beliefs and their experiences, and they did. So it was a really wonderful experience, and I just love the people of Lilydale, and they'll forever be in my hearts for how they welcomed me. But one of the most fascinating things that I was taught early on was this whole history of spirit photography. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had studied photography at the Rochester Institute of Technology, and we went over the history extensively. And this history is not written into any of the official history books that I learned from, but there is this very fascinating, bizarre photographic record of people trying to photograph spirits, invisible realms. And, since the beginning of photography, people were using photography in this way. It's just kind of, I guess, photo historians, some materialists believe that it's an embarrassing moment. So it's not included, but I think it's an important moment in the history of photography.
It's interesting that you would bring that up because you've seen, or you go online, and in fact, I've been to actually some shows that have dealt with the early days of photography, and it seems like that one of the first subjects that photographers took on when they learned how to start taking pictures was spirit photography. Now, there's been a lot of accusations that most most of these, and it's probably true that most of these photographs were faked, double exposures and that sort of thing. But then there are others that they go outside of the mold, so to speak. They don't look like what you would think of a double exposure or things like that. They look different somehow.
Yeah, it's a very complicated, bizarre, deeply. I always say that this moment within the history of spirit photography was one of the most absurd and dramatic and oddly compelling moments in photographic history, because the photos, some of them are, especially the ectoplasmic photos of the mediums half naked, stretched out with the stuff oozing from their bodies. I mean, it's very dramatic and weird, and there's this absurd these absurd visuals that they look fake, but when you read the reports of the mediums, it's totally in contrast to that, the fakeness of the image. When you read, people like Charles Richet, of what his experience of ectoplasm was, and he was a Nobel laureate in medicine. And, his descriptions of ectoplasm are completely fascinating and run against the absurdity of the images.
A lot of people think that some of these photographs showing the appearances of ectoplasm all took place, in dark rooms under red lights, or just conditions that you couldn't see very easily. However, there were a number that were very the records were very detailed, that took place in bright lights. I mean, it wasn't all just under dark or in curtained cabinets or things like that.
Yeah, I mean, when you go back and read the reports, it's really fascinating. But I also think there's another way that you could look at it. If you think that all the images are fake, it is interesting to consider that. Well, is this then the first religious iconography to be created with photography? Is that what we're dealing with? At the time when they were making the pictures, they were trying to create scientific proof of spirits. So it's kind of crosses this line into religion, and spiritualism always wanted to merge religion and science, and kind of finally answer all the questions and scientifically prove the spiritual realm. And I don't know. I think there's too much ambiguity there.
Now, some of your own photographs that I've seen are extremely interesting, and the one I'm thinking about in particular, talking about ectoplasm, is, and I can't think of the gentleman's name, but the gentleman who his hand looked like that it was enlarged or wrapped almost in some kind of substance. Do you want to tell us a little bit about those photographs?
Yes. So that is a physical medium in England named Gordon Garforth. And he says, ectoplasm can manipulate his body. So he said to me, when you come to my seance, ectoplasm, it changes the shape of my face and it enlarges my hands. And I thought, okay, well, I'm probably not going to see this in the seance, because sometimes you run across these situations where people tell you you're going to see something and you don't, and it's a very subjective experience. So but I went into the seance with an open mind. I sat in the front row. I was about 6 feet away from him. He was wearing a short T-shirt. And his wife was the kind of leading the ceremony, or the seance. And she's about 20 minutes in, she says, okay, the spirits are now going to work with Gordon's hands and change their shape. And so he put out his hand, and it's the most magical thing I ever saw. It just looked like effortlessly skipped into this gigantic form. And I screamed, which is like a very impolite thing to do in a seance. And then everybody else started screaming too. And I couldn't tell, are they screaming because I'm screaming, or are they screaming because they're seeing this big hand? And So I did it. This hand was gigantic that I saw, and I was convinced because when you're under the red light in the dark rooms, your eyes play tricks on you. And I thought, okay, I've hypnotically rendered this large hand, and when I'm going to see my pictures, it's going to be a small hand. But no, on my camera were these gigantic hands, and they looked different than they looked with my eye. And people will say to me, "Oh, that's a mask, or that's a glove, or it's a prosthetic," and I'm telling you, it was not. I mean, if it was a magic trick, it was the most elegant, gorgeous magic trick I've ever seen in my entire life. But I love that the image has an ambiguity about, like, it's really unclear what is going on.
Now, has there ever been a case where the lights have come up and the ectoplasm is still present?
No, I mean, not that I've seen. I mean, there have been, like, the famous story, for example, of the medium Helen Duncan, who the cops ran into her seance when she was doing ectoplasm, and they turned on the lights, and she's kind of like a spiritualist martyr because she died 6 days later. And
that's the woman in the UK that was accused of witchcraft.
Yes, the last person to be persecuted.
Yeah. In fact, we have one of our favorite guests is Ben the Porter. He works in the hospital as a porter, and he has a great interest in the paranormal and 14 things, and he's written and done a lot of research on her. So we've promised him to come on the air in a month or so to talk about that case, because it's always fascinated me, and he's like the main honcho over there. Are you affiliated with the Psychic News? It seems to me that I might have read something about you in there.
I'm not affiliated, but I've had work published in it several times.
Yeah, I tried to get the publisher on the show, and he promised me for later in the year, but he said he couldn't do it at the moment. They have been running that magazine for 70 or 80 years. It started out as a tabloid newspaper. In fact, I remember when back in the 60s, getting a couple of copies and advertising in there, and now it's a really high gloss publication that carries articles, and I was surprised more than just on spiritualism. In fact, they had an article on cryptozoology in the last issue, and UFOs on the cover. So just like the ufology has progressed into the spiritual areas, the spiritualists, the people have motivated more indeed towards some of this other 14 phenomena. Of course, they've been writing. I remember in the 1950s even reading articles that the spiritualist groups were writing about UFOs and things like that, and had their own interpretation. Are you familiar at all with the work of Mark Macy?
Yes.
And well, can you describe that and tell us what you think about that?
So I forget what he built. He built a device, the spirit.
They take photographs off the computer and the TV set.
Okay, yeah. Well, the larger movement
ITC, I think he calls this group.
Instrumental transcommunication. Yeah. So that would be when you use cameras, video, recorders to create evidence. And the Skoll group they're the ones who kind of really inspired the movement of ITC, and because they were creating video and photo and all of these artifacts. So Mark Macy built a device, I think it's called an illuminator, and I believe he was using Polaroid film. And I've talked to several people who had their pictures taken by him and said it was a very bizarre experience. And the images, they look like long exposures. They're kind of blurry, but you can see the person's face, but it always looks like there's another face kind of embedded in the blur.
I've tried to get him on the program for the longest time. I have met him on several occasions. In fact, we did a conference, a New Age spiritual conference, a dozen or more years ago in Colorado Springs, and he was one of the speakers on the program. He lives out around there, and it's they've also been receiving messages on answering machines of people who have been deceased for a number of days, if not longer. In fact, I remember, let's see, there was an actress by the name of Gazelle McKenzie, I believe her name was. They were going back quite a few years ago. But when she was a little girl, she lived in a hotel or an apartment building somewhere where they still had a telephone switchboard operator. There was no direct calls. You had to go through the switchboard. And one night, I guess she was in maybe 8 or 9 or 10 years old. The phone rang rather late at night, and it was the voice of her grandmother. It didn't have too much to say, but to the effect, so long, I'm going to miss you, and so forth and so on. And then the line went dead. Well, now, she told her mother about it, and her mother had found out or gotten a telegram. That was a way of communicating in those days. If somebody had, died in the family, that grandma had passed away around the same time that the telephone call came through. So they didn't know. Well, maybe a grandma knew she was going to die. Maybe she had been ill for a few days or something like that, and wanted to talk to her granddaughter. So they contacted the front desk the next day. To see what time the phone call came through and so forth, and the operator and the switchboard insisted that they had not received any call to that particular apartment. There are a couple of in fact, I think there's a whole book written. Tim, do you remember who the author is? There's a whole book written on telephone communications from
phone calls. Phone calls by from the dead. One of the authors was the late D. Scott Rogo.
D. Scott Rogo, that's an excellent book, and I always was surprised that there really was no follow-up on that.
Well, Rogo passed away, unfortunately. He was murdered not too long after that book came out.
That's what I remember, yes. Now, what would you say, Shannon, is are there any new forms of communication that have come to your attention? Now, we talked about the messages coming over the TV set and the computer and all. Is there anything else that you're aware of where this is progressing? I mean, does it seem like the ability to communicate from over there to over here is improving, or is it at a standstill like it has seemed to be for over 100 years?
No, there is a lot of interest in using technology, as there always has been with spiritualism. But,
yes.
There's all these new apps out. They have Ghostbox apps and, different, there's people who do CAPTCHA. The CAPTCHA that like you get a phrase or to prove that you're not a robot, when you're it's like a security measure when you're on the web.
Right.
I am a robot.
Well, I know people who've gotten messages through CAPTCHAs and they save them. And there's also the orb photography movement, which I would say is the spirit photography of today. And there's a lot of serious practitioners doing a lot of different work with orbs. And some of it's pretty interesting.
Well, Les would know about that. Are you into orbs at all? I mean, I know a lot of people think that they're dust on the lens and so forth.
No, I have a very interesting story to tell you guys. I was in Sedona, Arizona, and I met up with a lady there who claimed to have a lot of pictures of orbs. And so I went out to her place, and it overlooks a canyon. And so she says, now, I can tell, you might not see it, but I can tell when an orb is going to appear. And what I'll do is I'll just start clicking my camera. So I said, okay, want to see what's going to go on. So she has digital cameras, which we can, download and see right away. So she sits she stands at the corner of her house overlooking the canyon. And then she says, okay, I'm going to start taking pictures. And she took a bunch of pictures. And I was in one of the pictures, that she took. She started scanning across. And there was an orb over my head. Now, this was an interesting orb because it had like a little red cap on it. And since she was taking one picture right after the next, you could see that little red cap move. okay, from one position to the next position. But more fascinating was some of the shots that she took, and she would blow it up on her computer, enlarge the size. And that's what really blew me away, because you know what grays look like, guys, right? Well,
of course,
they were in the orb, and it's like they were looking through a portal. And one was like looking straight ahead, another one behind was looking in another direction, and then there was a third one that was still looking still in another direction. That was the most fascinating night, talking about orbs. And yeah, it seems like orbs have become even more, prevalent than your standard, flying saucer type of
and Sedona is the place to go if you want to have a UFO or some kind of strange experience. I know I've had a couple of really bizarre synchronicities that we've talked about on the air here. I mean, it all centers around the coffee pot, which is the local place to get your omelets and coffee and go to brunch. Right. Kind of all kinds of strange. Well, it's a vortex. It's one of the vortex areas, and right near the airport there. And strange things seem to happen in the parking lot. I just it just boggles the mind. The relationship between UFOs and the paranormal and synchronicities, but certainly Sedona. There's a good chance you might have some sort of a weird experience. There was a ranch there.
Let me interrupt you, Tim. We have to go to our break here, so we'll be right back.
It's the Bradshaw Ranch.
Doing to me here?
Oh, no. Wait, no. I guess maybe we have a little bit longer. We now just hit the 1 minute mark.
It's the Bradshaw Ranch.
Bradshaw Ranch. Yes. We have a fellow there who, of course, Bill Hamilton was a good friend of mine. We've published some of his work and done interviews with other people who live in town there who have had a great many just very strange experiences, and a number of paranormal photographs are amazing. I mean, everybody, it seems, that picks up a camera, sees something unusual. You got to go to our YouTube site, Mr. UFO Secret Files, and type in Sedona there, and you'll find some fascinating interviews that we've done in the past.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Back for the final segment of Exploring the Bizarre. And Shannon, I wanted to say that from the photographs that I've seen so far, I've really been enjoying them, because even though that a lot of these photographs really do seem to show anomalous things, you don't really have an axe to grind. I mean, your attitude is like, this is a photograph, you can, believe it or not believe it. I don't care.
Yeah, I guess, and that angle frustrates some people, but I really do think it's the only way to go, because these experiences are partially interior as well. So there's always an element that obviously I cannot photograph. And so the photographs kind of resonate with the experience, but they're not exactly documenting the whole thing. And I've had such strange synchronicities with the pictures, and to a skeptic that will always be just a coincidence, and to a believer that would always be incredibly meaningful. So I'm not, and I just feel like it's a waste of time, because these experiences, unless somebody has a personal experience, they're not going to become a believer just because of my photographs, and vice versa. So I guess it took me a while to get to that place where I just keep it open-ended, but I feel very comfortable there.
Well, and I appreciate that, because anymore it seems like that you see on the news. Rather than reporting the news, everybody is telling you like what they think the news should be, and they it's it's just become so. I can't think of the right word here, but with your photographs, I mean, you're just presenting them as they are, and you let the readers make up their own mind. Now, out of the photographs that you have taken, and besides the guy with the elongated hand, can you give us another example of a situation that you took pictures of that during the time you were like, wow, this is just really bizarre?
Yes, actually, there's and this is on my site. I only have small samples of the images on the site. I do have hundreds of pictures that will be in the book, but so this was a happening with the same medium with the enlarged hand, Gordon Garforth. I took some pictures of him in a trance. It was kind of like an impromptu trance, and the room was only lit by a green security light. So my exposures were very long, and he said his face was going to change shape, and I took a bunch of exposures, and obviously, being long exposure, there's some blur, but in every picture, in many of them, he looked like a different people. And there was one in particular where he looked as if he was wearing glasses and had like this tiny mustache. And I was actually afraid to show him this picture because I thought the mustache looked a little bit too uncomfortably close to like a Hitler-esque mustache. And I thought, oh God, I can't show him this. But I did. And he said, oh, that's my favorite image. And I thought, what? Really? Why does he like this picture? That I think it's a little bit spooky. And then he took me back to his home and showed me a picture of his great-grandfather. And it's actually him looking as if he's a spitting image of his great-grandfather. And on my site under physical mediumship, I have them paired together so you can see this bizarre photographic synchronicity that there was no way I could create. That was a function of the shutter.
We'll put up some of those shots on our YouTube channel. We'll have that up in a couple of days. The YouTube version of this on Mr. UFO's secret files. We have 5,000 or 6,000 subscribers to our show over there, and we always add a little visual to it, since it is YouTube, not radio per se. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead, Richard.
Oh yeah, so I call that like a photographic synchronicity, and I've had many of those where it's this odd experience where the process kind of resonates with the invisible experience that I'm being told is happening, but I can't see with my eyes.
Now, are you using film or digital cameras?
Now I'm using digital, but I did begin shooting film. So I've done both, and I think either is a worthy endeavor. I've also used infrared cameras. Some people use thermal cameras. I've been kind of interested in maybe playing around with that. But for the most part, I'm just with a regular 35 millimeter professional camera and a tripod.
Yeah. Remember, there used to be a fellow who lived out there in California, Arnold Constable, I think it was, who took photographs of the sky in the desert, and all these weird, well, he called them space animals, would appear.
Oh, yeah, I'm not familiar with him actually, but I know of other people that have taken pictures, using various types of cameras. Infrared, for instance, is very, if you look through like a video camera through the eyepiece, it records an infrared. It'll show you infrared images, and so you can actually see things that you wouldn't normally see with your naked eye. So there's a lot of ways to do these things, and I'm sure that either using a digital camera or a photographic, the old style, as they say, would produce some interesting effects for sure.
What about these nighttime photographs now that have been taken through the I call them opera glasses?
Night vision.
Night vision, yeah.
Yeah, night vision. Yeah, those are very interesting, and once again, you're seeing triangular craft. You're seeing things that are, going along at a very high rate of speed, and then doing a right angle turn, which is any kind of humanoid in there would have been mush.
Well, from some of the descriptions, they may be mush. we've had the Pillsbury Doughboy that was seen, Echelon Tire, and back, Tim, wasn't it in Italy or France during the Big Flap of 1954?
Right.
They had a couple of weird little bumping humanoids that were there on the railroad track that looked like some of these emojis in the on your telephone.
Almost like walking trash bins.
So very, very peculiar indeed. Have you seen anything though through the night vision?
Yeah, I actually have. It was a triangular craft. It was just basically points of light that were connected. You couldn't see. It was at a pretty high altitude, and the way it was traveling and the speed it was traveling, again, you'd have to. It wasn't a satellite because we checked the. There's a site you can go to check satellite when they come through, etc. And then it wasn't that, and so. Through a process of, this is it isn't that, or it's got to be this type of a thing. So
now, have you? We've talked tonight about ectoplasm and taking photographs in the seance room. Have you ever taken pictures of anything and had it come out where you couldn't explain what was on the film?
Myself, no, but I've gotten photographs from people that have had experiences, and it does look like, if you want to call it ectoplasm, that type of a photograph. By the way, one little factoid about ectoplasm, there was a gentleman, I guess, in France that coined the phrase. Rickert, I think was his name. Shannon, I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yeah, Charles Richet.
Charles Richet. Yeah. I don't speak French very well, I guess. But
she knew it all right away.
Right, she did. And he was kind of an interesting character. And I don't know if you ever saw the original movie Topper with Cary Grant in it, but that's
great movie.
Yeah,
especially when he drank the martinis.
But it's interesting because they used the term ectoplasm in that movie. And that movie was made in 1937.
Indeed, yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and it's a great movie. It's funny as hell.
Yeah. Well, I was looking here, in fact, in the one of the recent issues of the Psychic News, and there's a fellow, again, I've tried to get him on the program. I hope to have him on in the future, Gary Swartz, who lives, I think, in either in Arizona or California, who's been working, building some sort of device or telephone to talk to the other side. Have you researched his work at all?
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Shannon. No, you take this one.
Oh, well, I know a lot of people who know his work, and he actually, yes. I think in the 90s, he also did a study on mediums. And I know several of the mediums who were in that study, but yes, I forget what it's called. It's some kind of a phone device to talk to the dead.
Well, I think it's the soul phone.
The soul phone.
Got to have one of those. In fact, his, I would say partner, or at least a fellow that he's worked with in the past, Paul Davis, has been on our program, and he wrote a book and did a videotape recently about. Are you familiar with Forey Ackerman, who used to publish Famous Monsters magazine? And he was a devout atheist, but apparently after his passing, he was a friend of all these magicians and all who think that everything that happens in the seance room or is a part of spiritualism or UFOs is a total fraud. Apparently after his passing, he did manage to come back and prove proof of survival. I don't know. Do you think? I mean, Shannon, would you say there is proof of survival? I mean, what does this all mean when you shake it up and put it down in front of you? What is the end results here?
I do think that there is a lot of evidence that mediums are getting information and that they could not have known, and they're having the experience for themselves that it seems to be spirits from the dead. I don't know if you know the work of Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Institute, but they're doing double-blind studies on the information mediums bring forth in readings, and it's pretty compelling. And I think they're doing a good job at saying, hey, there's information coming here. I've talked to parapsychologists.
Where is the information coming from?
Right. Like I've talked to parapsychologists who believe that, it's just psychic. They're getting the information from your brain and then they're assigning the agency to spirits in their own, but you talk to mediums and they say they're absolutely sure beyond a shadow of a doubt that they're speaking to spirits of the dead. So, I don't know. It's still being debated what's exactly going on.
Yeah, of course. Now, our buddy that's been on the show many times, Paul Eno, he is of the opinion that this is all kind of a multi-dimensional layer, and that some of these voices and this information are coming from somewhere else. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be, your deceased aunt or uncle or somebody else. Well, how prevalent would you say fraud is in the spiritualist field today? Because I remember back in the 1960s, I saw a film that was made, I think, at Camp Chesterfield, where they had put in infrared cameras, and the spirit behind the curtain and the ectoplasm was really some other medium posing as some great Indian from the other side.
Yes, that's there was a great book written about that whole debacle. It's called The Psychic Mafia by Alan Spraggett, and my friend William Rauscher wrote the foreword. It's a really great read. I highly recommend it.
Right.
But as far as fraud, you're definitely going to find a lot more fraud when you get into the physical mediumship seances. But as far as clairvoyant goes, maybe there's some mediums who are... I've found mostly sincere practitioners who really believe in what they're doing.
Yes. And I would. Now, how about some of these great mediums of the past, like Holm, and that were supposed to levitate and move about the room and lift seance tables without any form of chicanery being involved? I mean, do you think a lot of this was, honest mediumship, or was it trickery and a form of entertainment to some degree?
I'm kind of a both and person. I think sometimes there's a term in spiritualism called mixed mediumship, and the famous medium Eusebia Palladino would say, "Hold me tight or I'll cheat." And when they were able to,
women I've known, yes, go ahead, yeah, never mind.
When they were able to get her under really, really strict controls, she was still able to produce the phenomena. But if she could cheat, she would, to make it easier for herself. Holm is one of the big enigmas of all time. He's really, people are, to this day still pondering his. As far as I know, he was never caught.
And then, of course, you had the great slate board phenomena, where they put a piece of chalk between two pieces of slate and ask the spirit questions, and it would answer when they took away the slate. Peel the slate. Maybe we need a slate board to communicate. Hello.
Well, it was the same thing with the spirit paintings, where the canvas would just within, it seemed like a matter of minutes, would have these absolutely glorious paintings on them. And I think Shannon actually has some photographs of some of these examples. And I'll tell you something: if these were cheating, whoever the artist was, living or dead, they were absolutely excellent.
Now, in the let's see, Camp Chesterfield, was that the one near you, Tim?
Yes, Cap Chesterfield and near Anderson.
They had didn't they have some of those paintings hanging on?
Oh
the
yes,
wall?
yeah. They have it. They have just an absolutely glorious gallery of some of these paintings that go back for decades.
And I remember a year or so ago we had a couple on the Exploring the Bizarre here that did. They would sit with people and do paintings and or sketchings, and when they showed them to the individuals who were were there for a piece of art or psychic reading, they would be remarkable renderings of members of their family who had passed away. And I think that's kind of hard to cheat. I mean, you might have somebody in the parking lot taking down license plates numbers and getting social security numbers or something like that, but finding out what your cousin or your uncle twice removed looked like, who lived 100 years ago, I would think it's a little bit harder to do.
Yeah. Tim, I wanted to ask Les real quick before we run out of time. Since we've been talking about photography, I know that there have been some abductees who have tried to film their abductions, setting up a camera in their bedrooms or anything like that.
Right.
Do you know, has there been any, success in these attempts?
Very little. Very little. There have been photographs. I've received photographs from people supposedly of the alien, and it's hard to discern.
Well, there was Anne Druffel,
Mm-hmm.
who's written a couple of books on the subject. She had a minister who's Bailey, I think his name was. Boy, what a memory I have for this guy.
Yeah, Reverend Bailey,
Reverend
you're right.
Bailey, who had these ET types coming into his bedroom at night, and he did manage to take a couple of photographs up against the shades, to the outside. They kind of look like hand puppets to me, but you can't say. They also resembled some of the figures that were photographed in during the seances. So that's a peculiar case right there that I'm familiar with. And then, of course, you get a lot of these YouTube reports, which are totally impossible to verify, of graves and aliens of one type or another popping up in the doorway or coming out from behind a telephone pole or something like that.
Right. You get a lot of people, though, that can actually draw what they've seen, which is a lot better in most cases. I was down in Gila Bend, Arizona, and out camping one night with a couple of people, and there was a spectacular UFO sighting. We all had cameras. I had a video camera. We started to roll, and nothing showed up. Nothing showed up in the film cameras or the video cameras. It was so frustrating. One was a blue orb that just kind of meandered down through this dry riverbed, and then the other one was like a bow tie, and it had yellow fringes around the outside with a red middle, and then it would alternate to a red outside and a yellow middle. I mean, it was spectacular, and nothing. I mean, this happens all the time. Where when you're in a situation like that, cameras don't work. We don't know why.
All right. Well, Les and Shannon, we are down to the last few minutes of our program, so I want to let everybody know a little bit more about where they can visit your website, find out more about you. Shannon, do you want to start?
Yes, I have a website. It's my name, ShannonTaggart.com, TAGGART. And the whole entire site is dedicated to my forthcoming book, which is being published by a crowdfunding publisher. So it's on pre-sale, and I'm about halfway there, and I need to sell, a few more copies to get it into production. But when it comes out, it's going to be lavishly illustrated, 350 pages of full color, forward by Dan Aykroyd, and everybody who buys it via this pre-sale will have their name listed inside as a patron.
Hey, do you do gallery showings?
Yes, I do gallery showings. I'm actually going to be in a photo festival in Uruguay in April, and they're going to.
I thought you were going to say in Brooklyn, so I could go.
Yeah,
Well, I'll come to Uruguay. I'll come to Uruguay. That's okay.
Yeah, they're going to print the images 7 feet tall and hang them in the city. So I'll have some of that.
Wow.
You'll
Wonderful.
get updates on that if you order the book. I'm going to be sending that out soon.
Wonderful. And Les, down to you here. Where do we hook on to you?
Yeah, take a look at our website at Opus Network. That's OPUS Network. That's one word, .org. And you can contact us there. We have an area where you can just, ask questions and, fill out requests to, be in the support group if you want to. And then I usually follow up and talk to these people to make sure that we're doing the right thing for them. And it's very effective.
Yeah. Well, Tim, I think we had a very enlightening show this evening. I know there were skeptics among our ranks who said, "Oh, how could you tie in, the work of these two individuals? It's totally unrelated." Well, once again, we here, as hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, had proven them totally wrong.
That's right.
Anyway, we will be, of course, archived in the next couple of hours for people who want to hear the show again, and it's a must-do. And, of course, our YouTube channel is Mr. UFO Secret Files. We've got almost 200 videos up there now, and it's a wonderful place to go and spend all your time before you buy a couple of books from us. Tim, good evening, and we will see you all next week, same time, same place, KCOR. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, one and all, and in particular, our two guests for the evening.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.